Good morning. We're learning as a chusr for Shlema Filan Chaya Baserach and as an aliyah for the neshama of Meir ben Elazar. We're on Daf Ayin Hey Amid Beis by the two dots, about a third of the way down. The Mishnah said, Rishim Shizuri Aimer Afilu, even if you have an animal that is 5 years old and plowing in the fields, it's going to remain a ben pakua, that it's not going to need shchita. If it was you shechted the mother and you found this baby inside and you brought it up, it's still kosher without a shchita many years later. This is the same as the Tanakama who also said that a ben pakua does not need shchita. The difference will be whether the animal is still going to be mutter if it was born, it put its feet on the ground. Meaning the Tanakama said that a ben paku is kosher without shchita, but it means if you shechted the mother and you found the animal inside and you killed it before it was running around. But once it starts running around, then there's takanas hachamim. We don't want such a thing that people will just cut off the head of an animal and eat it without a shchita, because people will not realize it's a ben pakua. Rishim ben Shizuri is not concerned about this. He says you could always, a ben pakua is always going to be kosher without a shchita. Amr Mishash Av. According to the Mandama, that says Av, meaning that the father of a animal is yichus to the father. Even if you say like of Shimon Shizuri that the animal a ben pakua can be shechted without any without a shchita, it could be eaten without a shchita. If you have a ben pakua that was the father of a behemoth together with a regular animal, a non-ben pakua animal, you're not going to have any option from the ben pakua side. It's not eligible for shchita. And from the mother, who's a regular animal, it needs shchita. We saw this before, and therefore this animal will be no way to make it kosher. You can't shecht it, you can't not shecht it, and it's not going to be able to be eaten. Somehow this passes down, the ben pakua status passes from the father to the child.
Where's the source for that?
This is troubling Lizzie also last time. He's saying, how could it be? Why should it be that the eligibility of the father causes the child to be ineligible for shchita?
Yeah.
I don't know. I didn't have an answer when Lizzie asked either. Did we have an answer? Lizzie, you remember this question,
So,
right?
so there was something about the fact that it has to do with the it has one of its simanim is considered shochet.
The problem is, right, when you have a
Again, that was what we saw. But there was,
yeah, I mean, it essentially this is the way it is, that when an animal that lost its ability to be shachat, a ben pakua, it's already shachat. So this is its current status, and that goes to a child as well. When it gives birth to a child, and as we'll see, this will even go the other way around, as we're going to see in the Gemara in a minute. If you have two ben pakuas that have a child, the taka doesn't need a shchita. This passes down from parent to child. Arambaya, let's continue. Hakol moedim b'kolot ben pakua shemuter. Everyone agree, meaning even the Tanakam who disagrees with Rav Shimon Shizuri says there's the takana that one cannot shecht a ben pakua if it was born, because of the chashash that maybe it will mix it up, and some will think you don't need to shecht a regular animal. But if it's a kullet, if it's an animal, this animal that was born had hooves that were not split, which we know is generally a kosher animal, even though this particular one has a defect that its hooves are not split, it still remains a kosher animal that could be shochet. If you have such an animal that's a ben bakua, it's mutter. My time of komilsa the tmiya mitka de kirila inshi. We're not concerned that people will mix it up, since it's already an unusual case because it doesn't have split hooves. That will also apply to. It will help us remember when someone eats it without shchita. They'll say, "Oh, this is the ben pakua that didn't have split hooves." Since it's an unusual case, we're not worried that people will extrapolate for that and say you could eat other animals without shchita. If you have a kolut that means that the hooves were joined, that was the child of another animal that was joined, that was the child of a ben bakua. Only in that case it's mutter. My time a tray to me a mitka tekiri inchi. You have to have a double strange situation, not just that it has joined hooves. It has to be the baby, the child of a parent who has joined hoofs, whose parents were a ben pakua, two ben pakuas. In that case, will that's strange enough that we're not worried we don't make the takana. Right? We often see that the davar that's not shchiach, like tiknu chachamim, there's no takana. This is considered that shchiach hanach. Amazir Yamar Chanina, halacha Shimon Tzuri, v'chein hayir Shimon Tzuri, mate bibnoi uben b'noi ad seif kol hadaris. Says halacha is like Shimon Tzuri that it's mutter, and this will extend to the children and the grandchildren as long as they keep marrying, as long as they keep breeding together with another ben pakua, the children will also become ben pakuas and not need a shchita. Rabbi Yechon Amar, hu mutter ubnoi aser. He says, no. He says that this only extends to the ben pakua itself, but the child is going to be aser, meaning even Rav Shimon Shazuri says the ben pakua is mutter, and he agrees in theory with the idea that the child should also be mutter. But he says over there we have to be misakin. That at that point people are not going to realize the ben pakua itself. There was a story of how with the you shechted the mother, you found it inside, but the child appears like a regular child, and therefore they are geyser on it. Ada bar Chavai havale ben pakua the nafel doiva ale. Ada bar Chavai had a ben pakua, and it was torn by a wolf. Also, and it became a treifa. It would have been a treifa. It should be a treifa based on the damage it sustained. Also, Kamei de Ravashi came to Ravashi. Amle zil shachte. He said, "Go shecht." Amle amaziri amar chanina. Allah Shimon Tzuri. V'chein Shimon Tzuri mate b'bnoy b'emnei atzev kol hadoris. Why are you concerned about this? This animal, this ben pakua that got ripped up and became a treifa, but we pass like Rav Shimon Shazuri, and according to Rav Shimon Shazuri, it's mutter. It's always going to be mutter. And Rav Yochanan only said no, that the son is not going to be mutter because of the Rav Shimon Shazuri will be masking. But the ben pakua itself, he says it doesn't need shchita. So why are you telling me to shecht this ben pakua that became they got an iser treifa? The iser treifa is not relevant. This animal you could cut off its head. It doesn't have to. It doesn't need shchita altogether. Amalei Rabbi Yochanan Shimon Tzuri Ka'amar Rabbi Yochanan that he said Ela b'noi aval iulai. Rabbi Yochanan disagreed with Shimon Tzuri. Even though he quoted him, he wasn't saying this is what I myself hold. He was just saying this is what Shimon Tzuri held. But he disagreed and he said a ben pakua does need shchita. In fact, Amar Rav Bachanina, Amar Ula, Amar Rav Chanina, halacha Shimon Tzuri. Lo yedel kol makun sheshanu Shimon Tzuri b'mishasenu halacha kamaisai. We have this statement that he said the halacha is like Rav Shimon Shazuri, and we have a general statement that the halacha is always like Rav Shimon Shazuri. Amalei anaki hasvirli. I hold a different thing. The Amar Reb, is that Rabbi Yochanan or Rabbi Yonasan? This Reb Nosson, or Reb Yechanan. Amar Reb Yechanan or Reb Nosson, halacha Reb Shimon Zuri b'mesukah b'trumas ma'aser shel demai. We only paskin like Reb Shimon Zuri in two other cases, but we don't paskin like him legabe ben pakua. What are these two cases? Mesukin and Trumas Meiser Zai. Mesukin the Tanam Rishano Yoim Hayetza Bakula Vama Kisu Get Lishi. If someone was being taken out in chains to be executed, and he said, "Write a get for my wife," but he didn't say, "Give it, write it, and give it." Harelu Yichtavu V'Yitnu. You should write it and you should give it. We assume he was very overcome by the situation, and he meant to say you should give it so that you shouldn't shouldn't be Neifel Yibim to his brother. So you assume that's what he meant, and you give it. They said it's not just someone who's condemned to execution, even someone who's going away on a long trip, and he says, right, it also means that you should give. He says, even someone who is deathly ill, who says, write a get, we don't just write it, but we also give it. We assume that's what he meant to say. Trumas Meiser Sheldmai. What is the Trumas Meiser Sheldmai? That means Trumas Meiser is the portion of the Truma that you give, the Meiser that you give, the Meiser that you give to the Levi, 1/10 of that has to go to a Kayan, and as a din Truma, that can only be by Kehanim. If you got it from if you got the mind, meaning you got tvua from Amaretz, so it's a chamu masakin that you have to be chayshish that maybe they didn't take off trumas and maisus. So we say that it's not trumas maisus shel demai shechazul im kaima. By mistake, you had separated it to give to a kayan, but then mistakenly it got mixed in together with the original tvua that was already had the trumas and maisus taken off of it. So really, it should be aser because now it should be aser, meaning the whole thing should have to be eaten only by a kayan, and which will obviously lower the value a lot if you can only sell it to a kayan to eat. He says, first of all, on Shabbos we're paskin that you can go back to the Amaretz and ask him. On Shabbos, it's also to separate anymore. So if you had not separated, we masakin that because of Einik Shabbos, we allow you to ask the Amaretz if he separated and will be Saimach on it, because most of the time Amaratzim do it. They do separate. And because you're gonna have a problem of Einik Shabbos, we allow you to do it. And he says, similarly, if you had mixed in this Trumas Meiser causing a great loss, he also allows you to go back to the Amaretz. It's the only way you're going to be able to save it. And you ask him, did you separate Trumas and Meiser? If he said yes, then it doesn't make a difference. Even though you separated Trumas Meiser from it, we could disregard that and just be samech on what the Amaretz did earlier that he had already given, and therefore you'll save the value of this whole thing, this whole bundle of tfu. Okay. We're on Daf Ayin Vav Amanal, who's starting the Mishnah. So it's important to understand before we start a little bit of the anatomy of the hind leg of a animal. Basically talking about behema gasa, as we'll see later on, but there'll be just nafkaminas about the tzemes hagidin. But essentially, there are three sections of an animal's hind leg. The bottom section, underneath the first joint, is all equivalent to a human's ankle. That means the bottom joint, the bottom part that ends with the hoof, is really all under by an animal. It's upright. An animal obviously doesn't have a flat foot, but what equivalent is on a person, which is from the ankle and above, goes all the way up to the first joint. Then from that joint to the next one is something which is equivalent to our shin, from the knee to the ankle. And then you have the third section, which is equivalent to a person's thigh, which is from the knee up to the hip. Those are the three sections of an animal's an animal's leg, and there are essentially two joints in the middle of it. The bottom joint, which is equivalent to the ankle joint, and the other joint, the next joint, which is equivalent to the knee. We call them both arkuvas. Arkuva, I think, is usually translated as a knee, but they both are called like different knees. There's the bottom knee and the top knee. So that's the mission. Behemish and nachtechu ragleha min arkuva lamata kshera min arkuva lamaila psula. If the animal's leg was cut off, if it's beneath the joint, it's kosher. It's not going to be a treifa, and you could still shech the animal and eat it. Then a kuvala maila psula. But if it's above that joint, it becomes a treifa. It can't live with that, and therefore it's going to be puzzle, and it's going to be a treifa, and shchita will not happen. V'chein shenitul tzaimas hagidin. Similarly, another thing that will make it puzzle is if you remove the tzaimas hagidin. As the Gemara is going to explain, on an animal, there are three sinews that connect. We'll see exactly the exact dimension of the tzaimas hagidin will be subject to some discussion, but it's essentially from the top of the lower joint, right? The lower joint that's extending from what would be the same as the ankle. In the middle section of the leg, on the top, right on top of the joint, are these sinews that connect the joint to the muscles above. So those are taken away. It also makes it into a treifa. Now, the din nishbar ha'etzem. If the bone was broken, we'll see which bone was broken. The Gemara will explain, the Rashi explains over here that this is a compound fracture, where the bone was not just broken, but it also broke through the surface of the skin. Habasa kayim shkitasa mitarasa. If the roiv of the basar that surrounds this bone is still there, it's covering it, then when you shech the animal, that part of the animal beneath the break, the part of the leg beneath the break, is still considered to be attached to the animal, and the shchita will be matar that piece of the bone. The Gemara will also talk about whether it becomes a treifa. But if not, the part that's missed, the part underneath the break, is not going to become tar with the shchita. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, Amar Rav Chia. Lamata. So the first thing we had said is from above the joint. From beneath the joint, it's going to be kosher. It's not going to become a treifa. From above the joint, it's going to be a treifa. But it doesn't say which joint, just as akuva. Akuva could mean either the lower joint or the upper joint, right? If there are three sections of the animal's leg, there are two joints between them. So which joint are we talking about? So Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav Chia Amar Rav Chia lamata min akuva lamaila min akuva. Lamata means underneath the joint, and lamaila means above the joint. Be'ezu akuva amru. Which joint are we talking about? Ba'akuva hanim kerasim harosh. That's talking about the bottom joint, which is called the joint that's sold together with the head. The bottom part of the underneath the lower joint, which is equivalent to the ankle. There's really no flesh there. It's just hoof and skin and bone. So it has no meat on it. So it's usually sold together with the head of the animal, which is similarly inedible. Maybe you could put it in a soup or something, but it's not, there's no meat on it. Ula Amaravashia, he disagrees. It's not referring to that joint. We're talking about the upper joint, which is visible on a camel. Meaning, we've been discussing how there are three sections of the animal's leg. On a normal animal, the upper section is inside of the animal's thigh. It's sort of not visible from the outside. If you take it apart, you can see it. But other than that, it's part of the flank or the shank of the animal. That's part of the part of the structure of the animal. It doesn't stick out. On a camel, however, it does stick out, that upper joint. So he says it's referring to that joint that would be visible on a camel, and that's the upper joint of a cow. Amalei Ula Rav Yehuda. So this is the machlekes is when the Mishnah said that if it got cut off on top of that joint, it's going to be a treifa. Underneath it's not. So Rabbi Yehuda Amarav said b'shem Rav Chia, that's a reference to the lower joint, that anything above the lower joint will make it into a treifa, but above it won't, underneath it won't. And Ula said that no, that's a reference to the upper joint. So anything above the upper joint will be a treifa, below it will not. So Amalei Ula Yehuda Bishlam Didamina connect de begamel nicker, that it's talking about the upper joint. That's what we added on the Tzaimis Hagidin, which is right above the lower joint. That will also passel. As the Gemara is going to explain later on, you can have something that is lower down that passels, even though the middle section of the leg does, if it's cut according to Ula, it doesn't passel, it doesn't become a treifa. But the Tzaimis Hagidin is a particularly vulnerable spot that it will become possible if it's cut off over there. Even though cutting it up above that is not possible. So that's what it's saying. It's adding on, even though we said that the middle section of the leg does not make it into, it's only underneath the upper joint that makes it into I'm saying underneath the upper joint is not a treifa, but a little bit lower down than that, on top of the lower joint where the Tzaimis Hagidin is, it will be telling. So that's what, it will become a treifa, and that's what the Mishnah is telling you. You said above the lower joint, which is where the Tzaimis Hagidin are, it's anyway a treifa. So what are you saying? V'chein Tzaimis Hagidin. That's the same thing. Amalei Rekuva below Tzaimis Hagidin, v'Tzaimis Hagidin below Rekuva. He says no. You can have that when it says first that it's going to be a treifa, if it's above the joint, it means even if you cut off the bone, you cut the bone. Chatcha means that you cut the bone without going through the sinus. You only cut the bone on top. So that's going to be enough to passel. Then it says if you cut the sinus without cutting the bone, that also will passel. In fact, Tani. That's not what the word nechtechu means. Nechtechu means that it was cut, means it was amputated. There's nothing left. It went through both the sinus and the bone. So why are you now changing it? That when we said when it says mekuva lamayla psula, you're saying not that it was cut, but just that the bone was cut. Ishte. He had no answer. Yudam Rav had no answer. Nafik, but after he left, of course, as always the case, he came up at that point. He had a great answer. Why didn't I tell him? Maybe I could have said, even though it's talking about the lower, I understand that when the Mishnah says underneath it's kosher and on top it's going to be a treifa, that's talking about the lower joint. Maybe it says, when it says lamaila from the joint, it doesn't mean right on top of the joint, but it means on top of the tzaimis hagidin, it's going to be a treifa. But if you also cut the tzaimis hagidin, that as well will make it into a treifa. Hadarama, but then he thought about it more to himself, and he said, "V'le'amrilei, didn't I give him a different teretz? I said it's talking about when you cut the bone without the sinus, without the tzemeh sagidin, or vice versa. V'amali nechtechu ktani, and he didn't accept that. He said it says nechtechu. So you would have, if I would have tried to tell him this teretz, just like he didn't accept the first teretz, he wouldn't have accepted this teretz anymore. So he did. He says, there was no point in trying to argue with him. He was set in his ways." Rapapa Masni Hachi. Rapapa has a different version. Amrav Yud Amarav, Amrav Chia, that same first version that we had said, that Lamaila, that it means on underneath is they're talking about the lower joint. Lamata lamata menakuva mitzomis hagidin. When it says lamata, it means underneath both the joint and the tzomis hagidin. Lamaila lamaina kuva mitzomis hagidin. And lamaila means on top of the tzomis hagidin as well. V'chein shenitul tzomis hagidim. V'chein shenitul tzomis hagidin. And then that's what the Mishnah is also adding on, that you take away the tzomis hagidin, which is really the teretz, I think that he had contemplated saying to Ula. Vakuva gufa kedeula. But according to this, when it says lamata menakuva mitzvah misagidin, lamayla menakuva mitzvah misagidin, misagidin, vakuva gufa kedeula. But he's not arguing about which akuva is. We're talking about the upper the upper joint, like Ula had said that. But when it said lamata menakuva, it means lamata menakuva mitzay misagin. It means all the way down beneath the entire middle section. It says lamata, even though we're talking about the upper joint, it means all the way on the bottom, underneath the whole akuva, as well as the tzay misagidin, and underneath the lower bone. But when it says lamaila, it means on top of the upper joint and in the upper section of the leg, and therefore akuva gufa, he's saying like ula.
So they don't argue?
Well, no, they do argue.
In what regard?
Because it didn't. According to Ula, he says that anywhere on the middle bone will be mutter.
Yeah.
According to this, he's not saying anything about that middle bone. He just says above the upper bone is going to be a treifa, and above the upper joint is treifa. Beneath the lower joint, as well as the tzemis hagidin, is beneath the lower joint is mutter, and in the middle section, it's only the tzemis hagidin that's going to be awesome. But it's mashma that we're not saying anything beneath the upper joint on that middle section, according to Rav Yehuda Amarav, is going to be possible. So I guess, yeah, I mean, I guess it's essentially I guess essentially it is the same thing as Ula. It's coming out. I guess the question is, why is he expressing it differently? It is essentially coming out that the upper joint is going to be the dividing line. Anything beneath it is going to be mutter, other than the same as agidin. Anything above it is going to be us. So now the Gemara asks the general question. There's Amar Avaishia. Omika mididilu madli pasikle v'chaya mitasi pasikle umesa. How could it be that on the upper section of the middle section of the leg, according to both Ula and the second version of Yehuda Amar Rav, it's going to be kosher, but the tzemes hagidin, which is lower down, if you cut it there, it's going to be pasul. How could it be that you have that it's lower down than sections that are, if you amputate it higher up, it's going to be, we'd say it's not a treifa, and then you amputate it lower down, it is a treifa. Amar Vashi, treifas kamam misladadi, einem treifas zed beim lezu. You can't say that we have that because it seems like it's lower down, that's less reason it should become a treifa. That's the reality, that you could cut in a different place and it could live. Another place, even lower down, it will die. Now the Gemara continues. What are these mysterious sinews that we're talking about? Rav Ashi or Asi, some have Asi, the agrama ulabar. The sinews are these thick cords that are embedded in the middle section of the leg of the animal, and where it's on the bottom, where it's closest to the joint, they're all together, and they're inside. They haven't started spreading out, and they're not embedded in the meat yet. So he says the agrama ulabar. He says when it goes up to where they start going away from the bone. That means right away by the knee. There's really no basa there. So it's the sinus, the tzemes hagidin are right on top of the bone. So where it starts spreading out, that's where it stops being the so from where they start to go away from the bone, that's where it starts being the tzemes hagidin. Rabbi Bar Huna Amarav Ashi or Asi the Agrama Ulagav. He says no, it doesn't start from where they go away from the bone. It starts lower down where they are attached to the bone. Rabba Breda Rabba Bar Huna Amarav Asi the Eloi Arkuma. They say even a lower place down. There's a certain bone called the Arkuma, which is it's part of the joint of that between the lower section and the middle section of the leg. This Arkuma is the bottom of the Tzemes Hagidin. Yatavum Rabban Kameder Rav Yosef Kamar, the Arkuma Gufa. They say that not only is it the section above this Arkuma, but also opposite Arkuma is also the Tzemes Hagidin. Amalei Rabba Letetzisule. You shouldn't listen to that which he says that opposite Arkuma is also part of the Tzemes Hagidin. Hachem Yehuda Heicha de Pari Tafchi. It's only the part where the butchers start to pull out these sinews when they're trying to make the basar better. And they first start cutting off higher. Over there, there's no flesh anyway. There's no need to cut off these sinews. V'hainu, Rabba Beider, Rabba Ravuna, Amar Ravasi, Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel. And that's what we said. I'm sorry, that's what we said. B'shem Rabba bar Rava bar Rabba bar Rav Huna, b'shem Rav Asi. We had it before as Rav Ashi, but we changed it earlier. So the Maseres Shas and the Hagoyes changed it to Ravas. So this is the same, that it's the area right above the Arkuma, which is the Agramo Lagav, which means from the place where it's attached to the bone, which is right on top of this Arkuma. That's the place where they start to spread out. Until how far? Until now we've been saying the lower boundary of the Tzemes Hagidin. Now I'm going to say how far it goes. When I was by Rav Yehuda, Amrulan, Shimu Mini Milsa de Migava Rabba Shmili. Listen to this thing that I heard from a great man, Umanu Shmuel. It's a place where they spread out. It goes from the place where they start spreading until they it comes to the place not where they're spreading, where they're together, right? They start out together and they go up until they start spreading out. When they start spreading out, that's the end of the Tzemes Hagidin. So above that, it won't become a treif if you cut. The kama, how much is that? Amrabaya, arba batati b'kol. It's 4 fingers, 4 etzpis, which is essentially 1 tefach on a cow. B'dakamai. And what about a small animal? Amrabaya, bliti havi tzemes hagidin, bli lo havi tzemes hagidin. As long as they're sticking out, they protrude. That's called tzemes hagidin. But once they're absorbed, once they're part of the flesh, then they're no longer tzemes hagidin. Ashuni have tzemes hagidin. When they're hard, it's tzemes hagidin. When they're soft, lo have tzemes hagidin. Alini have tzemes hagidin. If they're thick, it's tzemes hagidin. Continue lo have tzemes hagidin. But if they're thin, they're not. Chavuri have tzemes hagidin. As long as they're white, it's part of the sinus. Lo chavuri, when they start becoming more flesh colored, lo have tzemes hagidin. Ma baravashi amakivan de zigi avagav de lo chaviri. He says it doesn't have to be mamish white to be tzemes hagidin. As long as they're grayish color, that's enough. Amar Amem Mishmei Rav Zid. Shlasa chuti havi. There are 3 tzemes hagidin. as we'll see, on an animal. Chad alimu tre katini. Two are thick, one is thick, and two are thin. Ifsik, I guess when we said before that it's thick and it becomes thin, it's no longer tzemmes again. It's referring to this thick one. Ifsik alima. If the thick one was cut, as the roiv binyan, the thick one makes up most of the thickness. So you've cut a roiv of the thickness, and therefore it's going to be a treifa. If sekatini, if both of the thin ones were cut, as the roiv minyan, then you've cut most of the number of sinews, and that will also make it a treifa. Ma baravashi masni lekula. He disagrees. He says lekula ifsek alima ha'ikaroiv minyan. Even if you cut the thick one, you still have most of the sinews extent. It's a katini ha'ikaroiv binyan. And even if both of the small ones are cut, but you have most of the full volume of the sinews, because the thicker one is more than twice the size of the thin one, and therefore it's still not going to be a treifa. But ifis on a bird shitzachutehabi, there are 16 sinews. If any one of them is cut, it becomes a treifa. Maravashi have a keimne kamei da abba. I was by my father. I still kamei oifa. They brought before him a bird. He only found 15. Have a chad. Have a shani michavre. There was one that was different than the others. Nafsev ashrich trei. He examined it and he opened it up, and he found that was really 2, so there really were 16 simus, 16 gidin. Amar Yidam Rav. Simus agid she'amu berubai. The simus agid that we said means the rive. That if you cut most of it, it's going to be a treifa. My rubai, rive echad mehen. As long as it's a rive of even one of them, he's very machim. He asked, but there are 3. Even if you're saying if rive of one of them it becomes a treifa, but there are 3 of them, even if one of them is fully cut, you still have the other 2. And this is the roiv of the minion, so it shouldn't become, if it's only a roiv of one of them, why should it become a treifa? Zok the Gemara, Shmuel said, time it could trey. It's master from Shmuel. The only reason why it's kosher is because there still are 2. Halaka trey loy, upliga de rabbanoi. He's saying if there isn't 2, then it's not going to be kosher. So l'chayr is being chalik on rabbanoi. Damar rabbanoi amar Shmuel. He says, as long as it remains from one of them, even or on all of them, at least a thin amount of a string, ksher, it's not a treifa. The Iked Amri, and those have a different version of this. My rubai, what is the meaning? Where we'd ask, what does it mean, roiv? Roiv kol echad ve'echad. You have to have roiv of each one of them. Can we skip shul amli? Mechti tlasahavi, ha'ika tlas techol chad v'chad. There, as long as, even if you cut roiv of each one, as long as there's a third, which really means any portion of them, this should stop it from being a treifa because you have all of them. Misayeh lel Rabbi Damar Rabbi Amar Shmuel. As long as there's anything left over, ksheira, it's still going to be kosher. Okay, we'll stop over here. Yasher Kayach.
Thank
See you
you.
tomorrow.
Have a great day.
Have a good day.